for his word. Now, I want to share with you this morning a Good Friday reflection which was initiated in the church in the 17th century by a Jesuit. And in this reflection, we are asked to meditate on the moments when Jesus spoke his last 7 words whilst on the cross. There are 7 sayings, 7 words that are recorded in the Gospels that Jesus spoke in the time that he was hanging on the cross. And we meditate on these words while praying for those who in so many countries of the world today suffer injustice, thirst, and isolation. The Jesuit who wrote the reflection was from Peru, and he was familiar with those themes of injustice and isolation. So why don't we just pause and listen to the words of Jesus from the cross. To God, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. To the thief, truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. To Mary, his mother, woman, behold your son. And to John, behold your mother. He spoke to God, his Father, and he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? To all that were there, he cried out, I thirst. He spoke to all the world and declared, it is finished. And his final words to God his Father, these personal words, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Amen. Amen. You know, picking up on these words, there are just two thoughts I would like just to hold before us as we consider the words of Jesus. I think the first thing I want to say is that these words were deeply personal. Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's interesting that the words that Jesus chose to share were not random words. Actually, in this instance, my God, why have you forsaken me? In this instance, Jesus recited the first line of Psalm 22. Psalm 22 opens with, my God, why have you forsaken me? And what's interesting is that this particular psalm that he cried out with, the Jewish crowd would have known that psalm deeply. Every Jewish child, as they were growing up, were taught Psalm 22. They knew it off by heart. I guess it was a little bit like when I was at school, we were taught the Lord's Prayer, and back in the day, we were able to recite that, weren't we? And so this psalm was familiar. But what's interesting was that in growing up, the Jewish children would have spoken it out in Hebrew, the general language. But what we see here, it's recorded specifically that Jesus spoke out in Aramaic. Jesus spoke the language of the people. He spoke the language of the streets. And so I think what we can draw from that, Jesus wasn't leading an act of worship, wasn't reciting the prayer, joining up the dots. Actually, it was just a personal cry. He spoke his own language to his Father. He just spoke personally. It was a personal cry. It was a personal pain of separation, the feeling of loneliness and brokenness, that sense of separation. Jesus experienced the separation of sin. He took on our sin, and in taking on our sin, he experienced and encountered the separation with the Father. And so you get this personal cry. And I think the encouragement to us that I reflect on from this is that when we feel lonely, when we are full of pain, when we are experiencing brokenness, separation, when our lives feel like a shattered plate, we can cry out to God. We can cry out to God. Jesus models here just a personal prayer. My God, why have you forsaken me? And it doesn't matter what language you speak. It doesn't have to be flowery words. It's just an honest heart cry. And I think Jesus gives us permission to go personal with our Father. So the words of Jesus were personal, but I also think the words of Jesus point us forward. They're powerful. You see, there is a sense here that Jesus wasn't just referencing the first line of Psalm 22. There are scholars who would feel that by calling out the first verse, he was actually pointing to the whole psalm, because actually Psalm 22 starts in despair, but it journeys to a point of hope. And actually Jesus may have been drawn to Psalm 22 in that moment because, yes, it speaks of separation and despair, but it also speaks of a God who hears our cry. You see, later on in the psalm, there's a shift in Psalm 22, and we get these words. And actually, I think it's brilliant because I was thinking about it just this morning, actually. I was thinking Psalm 22 gives us the response of the Father. Verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me? is Jesus' cry, the cry of the Son. But later on in the psalm, you actually see the response of the Father to that cry. We gain insight to the Father in response. It says in Psalm 22 later on, this is the Father, for he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not, this is beautiful, he has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. This is the Father responding to the Son in the pain of separation. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. That's the response of the Father. He has heard the cry of the Son. In fact, actually, as the psalm goes on, it speaks of eternal relationship. It speaks of hope. It speaks of victory. And so there is a sense that this psalm is perfect, that actually, and it's intentional, that Jesus is expressing the pain of the psalm, but perhaps he's pointing also to the victory. The thing I want each one of us to take away is that God hears our cry. When there's a permission here to cry out in our pain, to get personal with God about what we truly feel, but what's brilliant is he can take it. When we're honest with God, what is his response? It's not to turn his back on us, not to say, well, if that's how you feel, that's it. Not at all. What does it say? He has not hidden his face. He listens to our cry for help. The truth is that God had not abandoned the Son. The truth is the separation was only going to be temporary. God had heard his cry. And as I say, I want us to the takeaway for us today is that God hears our cry too. When we cry out for help, God hears our cry. God never abandons us. The psalm starts with a sense of abandonment, but it ends with a sense of commitment and faithfulness on behalf of the Father. In other words, the cross is not the final word. Amen? Today is not the final word. The powers of evil did not have the final say. Satan did not have the final word. The cross is not the end. It's probably just the beginning. So on this Good Friday, on this day, as we consider the words of Jesus, we are reminded that, number one, we can speak to God personally. And I encourage you today, if you get a chance to be on your own at all today, why don't you just be honest with God about where you're at? It would be a really good Friday if today you were able to just unpack whatever you're feeling inside. And as we do so, we do it with the knowledge and the affirmation and the encouragement that God always hears our cry. Amen. Amen. Thanks, David.